In the spring of 1981, in the county extension office in Buchanan County, Iowa, a soil map hung on the wall behind the agent's desk. Every farmer in the county knew that map the way they knew their own fields. The good ground was shaded dark, rich black prairie loam that grew 150 bushel corn without breaking a sweat. The average ground was shaded gray. And then in the northwest corner near the river bluffs, there was a patch shaded almost white, 40 acres, class 6 soil. Rocky, thin, steep in places, the kind of ground where a plow blade hit limestone before it hit 6 inches deep. The county extension agent, a man named Dale Messer, had a name for it. He called it dead ground. Nobody argued with him. That 40 acres had been passed over, traded away, and abandoned more times than anyone could count. The last man who tried to farm it, a tenant named Sweeney, gave up after 2 seasons and told the landlord he would rather dig ditches for the rest of his life than fight those rocks one more day. The ground sat empty after that. Weeds took it. Cedar trees crept in from the fence rows. The county assessor stopped listing it as cropland. For all practical purposes, those 40 acres had been erased from the productive map of Buchanan County, Iowa. And then, in March of 1981, a man named Walt Gunderson bought it. 40 acres of the worst ground in the county. He paid $185 an acre when good ground was selling for $3,200. The John Deere dealer in town, a man named Phil Kramer, heard about it at the feed store that same afternoon. Phil was leaning against the counter with his gold watch catching the fluorescent light, halfway through a story about a farmer who had just signed papers on a new 4640, when someone mentioned Walt's name. Phil stopped mid-sentence. "Walt Gunderson just bought dead ground?" He laughed so hard he spilled his coffee across the counter. "That's like buying a coffin and calling it a house." The men in the store laughed. The feed rep from DeKalb laughed. The kid behind the counter smiled. And for a while that was the joke in Buchanan County, Walt Gunderson and his dead ground, the farmer who paid cash for failure. For a while that was the joke, then it wasn't. To understand why Walter Gunderson bought 40 acres of rock and abandoned soil, you have to understand the world he was buying it in. Because the story of dead ground is also the story of what happens when an entire industry forgets the difference between wealth and debt. Go back a few years. In the 1970s, American agriculture went through what economists would later call the Great Expansion. Export markets, particularly to the Soviet Union, drove grain prices to record highs. Corn hit $3.56 a bushel. Soybeans touched $10. Land prices doubled, then tripled. Banks stopped waiting for farmers to come to them and started driving out to the farms with loan offers and favorable terms, and the kind of confidence that only comes from people who have never watched a cycle complete itself. Between 1970 and 1980, the average price of Iowa farmland rose from $419 per acre to $2,147 per acre, a 412% increase in a single decade. Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives found themselves sitting on what looked like gold. The bankers and the equipment dealers and the fertilizer salesmen all said the same thing: expand, borrow, buy more land, buy bigger equipment. The world needs to eat, and you are the ones feeding it. So they did. They bought land at $3,000 an acre on borrowed money at 12% interest. They traded old tractors for new John Deere 4440s at $32,000 each. They built grain bins and hog confinements and machine sheds, all on credit, all betting that tomorrow would look like today. Then in October of 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to combat inflation. By 1981, the prime rate had reached 21.5%. Farm operating loans written at 9% were renewing at 18%. At the same time, President Carter's grain embargo against the Soviet Union collapsed the export markets. Corn dropped to $2.22. Soybeans fell to $5.20. And land values, the collateral underpinning every farm loan in the Midwest, began to fall off a cliff. The 1980s farm crisis had begun. Over the next 5 years, more than 300,000 American farms would be lost. In Iowa alone, land values would drop 63% from their 1981 peak. The Federal Land Bank of Omaha would fail, the first federal land bank failure since the Great Depression. Towns would empty, churches would close, and the suicide rate among farmers would rise to 3 times the national average. That was the world Walter Gunderson walked into when he bought dead ground. Let me tell you about Walt, because to understand what he did with those 40 acres, you need to understand where he came from. Walt was 44 years old in 1981. He had grown up on his father's 200-acre farm outside of Jessup in Buchanan County. His father, Hank Gunderson, had farmed with a Farmall M and a 2-bottom plow his entire working life. Never borrowed a dime after paying off the original mortgage in 1950. When the neighbors were lining up at the bank in the 1970s to take out expansion loans, Hank told every loan officer the same thing. "I don't owe any man anything, and I intend to die that way." He did. Hank died in the fall of 1978, debt-free, leaving Walt the 200 acres, a workshop full of hand tools, and a Farmall M with 11,000 hours on the meter. Walt's older brother had left for Des Moines years earlier and wanted nothing to do with farming, so it was all Walt's. Walt did not expand. He did not borrow. He farmed the 200 acres the way his father had: corn and oats in rotation, a few head of cattle, hay in the bottoms. He drove a 1971 Ford pickup with 140,000 miles on it. He wore the same Carhartt jacket for 9 years. While his neighbors were leveraging everything they owned to buy more land and bigger iron, Walt put $600 a month into a savings account at the Jessup State Bank. By March of 1981, he had $47,000 in that account. And that is when he went to the Brandt estate auction and bought dead ground. The 40 acres was part of old Elmer Brandt's place. Brandt had died without heirs and the executor was selling everything piece by piece. The good ground, 280 acres of Class 1 and 2 soil, went fast, multiple bidders, final price $3,200 an acre. Nobody wanted the 40. The auctioneer had to ask 3 times before Walt raised his hand. $185 an acre, $7,400 total, cash, no loan. No bank involved. That afternoon, Walt came into the feed store for a bag of clover seed. Phil Kramer was still there, still leaning against the counter, still wearing the gold watch. "Hey Gunderson, heard you bought the Brandt 40. Walt nodded. "The dead ground 40. Walt nodded again. Phil looked around at the men in the store and grinned. "Walt, I've sold equipment to every farmer in this county and I've seen some bad investments. But buying dead ground, that's like putting new tires on a car with no engine." The men laughed, the feed rep laughed, even the kid behind the counter smiled. Walt didn't say anything. He picked up his bag of clover seed, paid $14.50 and walked out. He drove home on the gravel roads with the sun going down behind the grain elevators, and he did not look angry and he did not look embarrassed. He looked like a man who knew something that nobody else in that feed store knew. Now let me explain what Walt understood about those 40 acres that everyone else had missed, because this is the key to everything that happened next. The problem with dead ground was not simply that the soil was thin and rocky. The deeper problem was that for 100 years, every farmer who touched it had tried to force it to be something it was not. They plowed it, they planted corn on it, they drove heavy equipment across slopes that should never have been cultivated. And every year the thin layer of topsoil that existed washed down the hillsides into the creek along the south edge, a little more each season, until there was almost nothing left. By 1981, the flattest sections had maybe 3 inches of topsoil. The slopes had almost none. The subsoil was heavy clay mixed with limestone fragments. The pH was 7.8, borderline alkaline because of all that limestone. The organic matter content was 1.2%. For context, good Iowa prairie soil runs between 5 and 6% organic matter. Dead ground had been farmed until it was biologically empty and then abandoned as confirmation of the verdict. But Walt did not look at those 40 acres and see what everyone else saw. He saw tired ground, not dead ground, tired. And there is a difference. The first thing Walt did in April of 1981 was walk every inch of those 40 acres. He carried a notebook and a soil probe, a T-handled steel tube his father had made in the workshop, and took samples from 47 different points across the property. He noted where the limestone was close to the surface, where the clay ran deepest, where water pooled after rain, which slopes faced south and which faced north. He mapped the whole thing by hand on graph paper, sitting at the kitchen table every night for a week. Then he did something nobody in Buchanan County had ever seen on that piece of ground. He did not plow it. He did not disc it. He did not plant corn or soybeans or anything the elevator would pay for. He planted clover. Red clover specifically, 15 pounds per acre, broadcast by hand from a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, walking those rocky slopes in his work boots while his neighbors drove air-conditioned cabs over flat black dirt. On the steeper slopes he seeded sweet clover and broom grass. On the lowest, wettest ground near the creek he planted reed canary grass to hold the banks. Phil Kramer drove past one afternoon in his dealership truck. He slowed down, watched Walt walking the hillside with his seed bag and shook his head. Later at the cafe he told anyone who would listen, "Gunderson's out there seeding dead ground with clover by hand like it's 1910, that ground won't grow clover any better than it grew corn." But here is what Phil Kramer did not understand. What most of Buchanan County did not understand. Clover is a legume. And legumes do something that corn and soybeans cannot. They fix nitrogen. Their roots form a relationship with bacteria called rhizobium, which pull nitrogen gas directly from the atmosphere and convert it into a form that plants can use. A good stand of red clover fixes between 80 and 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year, the equivalent of $40 to $75 worth of anhydrous ammonia, produced for free by biology. But the nitrogen was only part of it. Clover roots go deep, much deeper than corn roots, deeper than wheat. They push through heavy clay subsoil and create channels, tiny pathways for water and air to penetrate ground that has been compacted for decades. When the clover dies back in winter, those root channels stay open. The decaying roots become food for soil microorganisms. Earthworms come, fungi come. The microscopic life that makes soil function, bacteria, protozoa, mycorrhizal networks, all of it comes back to ground that has been biologically empty for decades. Walt did not harvest the clover in 1981. He let it grow through the season, let it bloom, let the bees work it, and then in October he mowed it flat and left it lying. The biomass went back into the soil, cover, mulch, food for the microbes working invisibly beneath the surface. The second year, 1982, he did the same thing but added something else: manure. He made a deal with a dairy farmer named Art Schultz 3 miles down the road who had more manure than he knew what to do with. Walt hauled it himself, 15 loads, using a Bart spreader and his Farmall M, and spread it thin across the flatter ground, about 8 tons per acre. The nutrients fed the clover fed the soil. The soil began, slowly and visibly to anyone paying close attention, to change. By the fall of 1982, Walt pulled another set of soil samples from the flat areas. The organic matter had risen from 1.2% to 1.6%. It does not sound dramatic, but in soil science, a 0.4% increase in organic matter in a single year on ground this depleted is not a small thing. It meant the biology was working. The soil was waking up. The county extension agent, Dale Mezer, the same man who had named it Dead Ground, heard what Walt was doing and drove out to have a look. He walked the 40 with Walt, pulled his own samples, and didn't say much. But when he got back to his office, he opened Walt's file and wrote a note in the margin of the soil survey. Gunderson doing something unusual, worth watching. The third year, 1983, Walt added another layer. He planted oats into the clover, a nurse crop that would give him a small grain harvest while the clover continued building the soil underneath. He also fenced the steeper slopes and brought in 8 head of cattle to graze the grass. Light stocking, 8 animals on 40 acres, moved every few days so no single spot got overgrazed. The cattle did what cattle do on well-managed pasture. They ate the grass, deposited manure, and pressed their hooves into the surface, creating small disturbances in the soil crust that became germination sites for new plants. At low stocking rates, that trampling is not damage, it is management. Meanwhile, the rest of Buchanan County was coming apart. The first wave of foreclosures hit in 1982. Farmers who had borrowed at 9% were now paying 18% on operating loans. Corn was $2.40 a bushel. Land values were dropping $200 an acre per year. The Farmers' Home Administration began issuing acceleration notices demanding full repayment on loans that farmers believed they had decades to retire. The choices were stark: voluntarily liquidate or be forced out. Bill Kramer's dealership, which had sold 32 new John Deeres in 1979, sold 7 in 1982. 3 of those 7 were repossessions from his own customers that he had to take back and resell at a loss. The showroom floor that had been full of shiny green iron was half empty. Phil started selling used equipment. Farmalls, which he would have laughed at 5 years earlier, were suddenly acceptable inventory. Walt watched it all from dead ground. He didn't say anything, he just kept planting clover. In the fall of 1983, Walt attended a meeting at the Iowa State Extension Office in Independence. The speaker was a soil scientist from Iowa State University named Dr. Richard Koenig, who had been studying something most farmers in 1983 had never heard of: no-till farming. The idea was straightforward but radical: stop plowing, stop disturbing the soil. Plant seeds directly into the residue of the previous crop and let the soil biology do the work that tillage was supposed to do. After the talk, Walt waited until the room cleared. Then he walked up to Dr. Koenig and showed him 3 years of soil samples from the 40 acres, the organic matter trend, the pH changes, the root depth measurements, the earthworm counts. Koenig looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. "How many acres?" he finally asked. 40. "What did you pay?" 185 an acre. Koenig was quiet for another moment, then he said something Walt would carry for the rest of his life. "Mr. Gunderson, everyone in this county bought the best ground they could afford and then mined it until it was average. You bought the worst ground in the county and you are building it into something better. In 10 years, your 40 acres will outperform their 400. Walt didn't tell anyone about that conversation. He went home and kept working. 1984, the fourth year, Walt made his first real crop on dead ground. He planted oats and red clover together on the flattest 25 acres. The oats yielded 62 bushels per acre. Not spectacular, but respectable. More importantly, the clover underneath was thick and healthy. He sold the oats at the elevator for $1.85 a bushel, total revenue of $2,867. His total operating cost for those acres was roughly $400, diesel for the Farmall M and seed, no fertilizer purchased, no herbicide, no chemical inputs of any kind. Net profit from 25 acres of ground that everyone said would never grow anything, nearly $2,400. On the remaining steep ground, the cattle herd had grown to 12 head. He sold 4 calves at the Jessup sale barn that fall. Total income from the 40 acres in 1984, just over $4,200. Total cost, $400. But the numbers were not the real story. The soil was the real story. In 1984, organic matter on the flat ground had risen from 1.2% to 2.4%. The earthworm count had gone from 2 per cubic foot in 1981 to 14. The soil was getting darker. You could see it from the road, a visible deepening of color across the sections Walt had been building, like watching a pale face recover its health. The limestone fragments were still there, but they were surrounded now by living soil that held moisture instead of shedding it. Dale Mezer came back out. This time he brought a photographer from the Extension Service. They took pictures of the soil samples and the root systems and the earthworm counts. Mezer measured the topsoil depth on the flat ground. 5.5 inches. It had been 3 inches in 1981. Walt, Mezer said, and it was the first time he had used the first name instead of Gunderson. I've been the extension agent in this county for 17 years. I have never seen soil recover this fast. Walt nodded. It was never dead, he said. It was just tired. In 1985, Phil Kramer closed his dealership. The building sat empty on the highway outside Jessup, the John Deere sign dark for the first time in 23 years. Phil took a job selling insurance in Waterloo. People said he was lucky to get out with his house. A lot of his customers had not gotten out with anything. That same year, Walt planted his first corn on dead ground. Not the whole 40, just 8 acres on the flattest, best-recovered section. He planted it no-till using a planter he had modified himself in the workshop, fitting coulters to cut through the clover residue and drop seed directly into the undisturbed soil beneath. No fertilizer, no herbicide. He was trusting 5 years of biological work to provide what the seed needed. The corn came up in uneven rows. The stand was thinner than a conventional field. Phil Kramer, unemployed now but still driving past and still talking at the cafe, told people, "Gunderson's corn looks like hell. Told you that ground was dead." Phil was looking at the rows, Walt was looking at the roots. When the August heat arrived, the kind that bakes Iowa clay into something resembling concrete and stresses conventional corn into rolling its leaves by noon, Walt's corn did not roll. The soil beneath that clover residue was cool and moist. The mycorrhizal fungi in the root zone were delivering water and phosphorus from depths that conventionally planted corn could not reach. The biological soil Walt had spent 5 years building was functioning like a living sponge, absorbing rainfall and releasing it slowly, steadily, through the drought. Walt's 8 acres of first-year corn on dead ground yielded 134 bushels per acre. The county average that year on ground that was supposed to be among the finest farmland in Iowa was 128 bushels. Dale Mezer picked up the phone and called Iowa State University. "You need to send someone out here," he said. "Something is happening on Gunderson's 40 that you need to see." By 1988, Walt had been working dead ground for 7 years. The transformation was visible from the county road. Where there had been weeds and cedar trees and exposed limestone, there was now a patchwork of dark soil, thick grass, and productive crops. The fence rows were clean. The cattle were fat and healthy. The creek running along the south edge, silted and muddy for as long as anyone could remember, was running clear, because the soil on the slopes above it was no longer washing away. Iowa State sent a graduate student named Corinne Price to study the 40 acres that summer. She spent 3 months collecting data, and what she found became her master's thesis. Organic matter had risen from 1.2% to 3.8% in 7 years. Water infiltration, how fast rainfall soaks into soil rather than running off, had increased by 340%. Soil aggregate stability had moved from poor to good. The earthworm population was 22 per cubic foot, higher than the county average on Class 1 ground. Coren's thesis was titled Biological Restoration of Degraded Cropland in Northeast Iowa, a 7-year case study. It would be cited in 12 subsequent academic papers on soil health and regenerative agriculture. Walt never read it, he was too busy farming. In 1988, he planted 30 of the 40 acres to corn. Yield, 148 bushels per acre. County average, 131. He used no commercial fertilizer, no herbicides. His cost per bushel was roughly 85 cents. The county average cost per bushel was right around $2. Walt was producing more corn at less than half the cost, on ground that had been written off as worthless. His net profit per acre was nearly 3 times the county average, and the land itself, purchased for $185 an acre in 1981, was appraising in 1988 at $1,400 an acre for comparable restored ground. His $7,400 investment was worth $56,000, a 657% return in 7 years, no bank loan, no interest payments, no risk of foreclosure. While his neighbors had leveraged themselves to the breaking point on $3,200 an acre ground that was now worth $1,200, Walt had bought the cheapest dirt in the county and built it into the most productive. The reckoning came on a Saturday morning in October of 1988 at the Jessup sale barn. Walt was standing at the fence watching the auctioneer work a pen of calves when a man walked up beside him. Phil Kramer, former John Deere dealer, current insurance salesman, wearing a cheaper suit than he used to and driving a car with someone else's name on the door. Phil stood beside Walt for a while watching the cattle move through the ring, then he spoke. "I drove past your 40 the other day, Walt. Looks different." "It is different." "How's the corn doing?" 148 this year." Phil was quiet long enough for 2 lots of calves to go through the ring. When he spoke again, his voice had something in it that had not been there at the feed store counter in 1981. "I sold 200 tractors in this county. Big ones, expensive ones. Told every one of those farmers they needed more horsepower, more acres, more iron. Most of them are gone now, lost their farms, lost everything." He paused. "You bought the worst 40 acres in the county with cash, planted clover on it, and you're still here. I think maybe you were the only one who knew what he was doing." Walt kept his eyes on the cattle ring. He nodded once, then he said the only thing he could think of that his father would have said. "The ground was never the problem, Phil, the debt was." Walter Gunderson farmed dead ground for 27 more years. By the time he retired in 2015, those 40 acres had organic matter levels above 5%, equal to virgin prairie soil that had never been broken. He had accomplished in 34 years what nature takes centuries to build. He had done it without a single commercial fertilizer purchase, without a single herbicide application, and without borrowing a dime. He never bought a new tractor. The Farmall M finally gave out in 1994 at 16,000 hours, and he replaced it with a used Farmall 560 he bought at an auction for $800 cash. He did not get rich. That had never been the point. He got something better. He got to stay. While 300,000 farms disappeared across America in the 1980s, while neighbors lost ground that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations, Walt's 40 acres got a little darker, a little deeper, a little more alive with every passing year. The ground that everyone had called dead had outlasted the boom, outlasted the crisis, outlasted the dealership and the loans and the equipment that was supposed to make farming easier, and instead made it impossible. He proved something that the soil scientists and the extension agents and the bankers and the equipment dealers had all managed to forget. The land does not need more money thrown at it. It needs time, it needs patience, it needs biology, and it needs to be free from the weight of debt that forces a farmer to extract more than the land can give. Dale Mezer retired from the Extension Service in 1998. On his last day, he went into his office and took down the soil map that had hung on the wall for 30 years. He looked at the white patch in the northwest corner, the 40 acres he had named dead ground back when he was certain that name would last forever. He picked up a black marker and colored it in, as dark as the best ground in the county, as dark as virgin prairie. Then he wrote 2 words underneath it. "Walt's ground,